Crushing the cultural Marxists. Breaking the grip of corrupt oligarchs. And taking back our country through America first. Here's your host of Liberty and Reality, John Henson.
Welcome back to Liberty and Reality. We have made it to the Dirty Dozen. We're on episode 12, and I appreciate everybody's support. Anybody that's continued watching my show and give me feedback on my content, I really do appreciate it. And I will continue working on this and continue making the product better as I go along. I know a lot of podcasters out there that have gained large audiences. They always have to start small. Everybody has to start somewhere, and that's where I'm at. I will continue to at least attempt to give you unique comment and unique commentary, unique takes on things I see going on in the world. Try to bring my experience and my knowledge in, and really put some thought into what I'm talking about and what I say in these podcasts. So I really appreciate you supporting me. Today we're gonna change topics here a little bit. I've gone hard here lately on the anti-communist stuff. Gone hard against extremism and some of these social movements I see destroying the country. And we're going to talk about some military things, some things that were kind of in my what I did in my career, my military career, a little bit closer to that, a little bit closer to the operational planning stuff. I'm going to talk about some of the challenges here because I don't think a lot of people really understand why we're having such a problem with a country like Iran. And if you listen to the government speak about this, every week it seems like there's something different. Either Iran is going to capitulate and they're not going to fight anymore, or we're going to bomb the shit out of them, or whatever different narrative. It just keeps changing. And the truth is, the problem is much more complex. And getting Iran to actually capitulate the way we're told they will is going to be nearly impossible, in my opinion. And I'll tell you why. One thing I'll say about military operations, when you write a military plan, you write it to defeat what they call the enemy's center of gravity. The center of gravity is the one thing, well, their most important thing, the thing that really allows them to maintain military power. You have to find out what that one thing is and find a way to defeat it. That's what we do. Now, there's different levels of this center of gravity. There's the tactical level. That's the guys fighting directly on the battlefield. There's the operational level, which is the larger battle space, the larger area. So that may be an entire ocean, maybe an entire country. And then there's the strategic level. That is the largest level. That is basically whoever your enemy is, that is the one thing at the top that you have to defeat at the national level. And it's always going to be the will of the people, every time. Now, as I've said before in a previous episode, this is a civilizational clash. It's a civilizational struggle. And the Iranians see this as a matter of national survival. And they're just not going to give up without a big fight, a much bigger fight than we're bringing now, unfortunately. And we really don't have the national will to do that. It would have to be horrid. We've only been able to generate that type of national will when the United States itself has been attacked. And we've had to respond. We've looked for revenge. And think about the War on Terror. Think about World War II when Pearl Harbor was bombed. That's the only things that have gotten Americans to respond in that way. And there's nothing here that compels us to do that. So you would have to think on the scale of Probably firebombing their cities, carpet bombing their cities, just destroying everyone. The loss of life would be catastrophic, and we could do that. That's the one thing that Iran risks by being so, I guess, stubborn and so unwilling to negotiate this, that we do control the escalation. And if somebody was crazy enough to do that, if somebody staged something that got the American people behind that type of tactic, that type of terror, I guess. I don't know what we would call that type of military action on that scale. We could do that. We really could. We are governed by things like the just war theory, where we only use as much military force as necessary to defeat a certain enemy, but that doesn't mean genocide. And we as a country have our limits, and there's only so much that the American public will stomach. And if you want an example of that, just go back to Vietnam, and that there's a limit to that. There really is. So, since we're not willing to do that, we're going to continue to fight this limited war. We have some challenges, and I want to explain them here and why we have those challenges. So, we look at the big problem we've had, and really what we have, the military problem we have with Iran is called an anti-access aerial denial problem, A2AD. That's a military concept where our enemies have built weapons to outrange and destroy our military assets. And a lot of times it's a geographical problem, but it's a range issue for us, and in terms of the evolution of strategy, anti-access aerial denial is what we would call a sixth-generation warfare weapon, what the Russians call non-contact warfare. Now, we talk about generations of warfare. A lot of times it's a matter of sophistication of the weapons, but not in this case. It's not sophistication. It's actually the opposite. It's a asymmetric strategy, more likely, I guess you could call it. There is a technological element, but it's not that. And it relies on long range, precision missiles, drones. It requires sensors in space many times, satellites, or at least in Iran's case, allies that have satellites. And it's used to destroy an enemy's high value military assets, which we have with our fifth generation weapons. And often the enemy can destroy these assets from thousands of miles away without ever having to get close and fight. And remember, these countries are fighting on their own home soil. They don't have to go overseas. They don't have to create machines of war to go overseas and fight. They just have to defend their own territory. They have to defend their own castle. And so when you consider that, Jocko said on his podcast recently something that I thought was really appropriate, that this is a siege. This is like a castle siege we're doing. And when you have a castle siege, you have to really wait out your enemy. You have to surround them and starve them out. But I don't know that we're going to be able to do that with Iran, because they have Russia there, they have China there, they have a large land area where they can bring in the things they need. And, it's very difficult to do a siege against a country like Iran. The geography just doesn't permit for it. It'd be different if it was an island nation, like what we did with Japan. We were able to really conduct an effective siege there because we could surround the island. We could keep logistic ships from coming in, and we could just, along with the absolute destruction we brought on Japan with firebombing and nuclear weapons. But really, we choked them off. We choked off their oil and their food supplies. And that was one of the big reasons we made them capitulate. But you can't do that with a land power many times. Now, our offensive power relies on very expensive fifth generation assets, and they're great. They're great assets. You got stealth fighters, and you have Aegis ships and aircraft carriers and stealth fighters, and all these great electronic warfare and sensor technology on our combat units. But we've traded that for shorter ranges in many categories. Um, it's just the nature of the way we've conducted combat and the way we've done our acquisitions. And also, we have a finite number because we've gone to high tech units. We can only build so many. So there's only so many resources to go around. And so when you hear people talk about the Chinese Navy is much larger than the U.S. Navy, that's true, but their ships are nowhere near as advanced as ours. So there's a trade off that we make in what our enemies are making, our rivals. I shouldn't call them enemies. It may not be fair in the case of China, at least not yet. And, like aircraft carriers are huge, and sinking one of them caused a big problem for the United States. So they're one of the major targets I'm talking about that our enemy can reach out and hit from thousands of miles away or hundreds of miles away, depending on where they're at. We also have to worry about protecting our shipping lanes, including our commercial shipping lanes. And long range missiles also threaten a lot of our land bases, our supply hubs, our airfields, our military personnel. So anything inside the enemy's missile range can become a target. So anti-access and aerial denial work together as a two-part strategy to neutralize our power. Anti-access primarily uses those long-range missiles, those long-range drones, to keep our forces out of the region. Once we get past those and we find a strategy and the combat power to get past those, the aerial denial uses shorter range systems like coastal artillery, sea mines, and really in the case of Iran, they've mastered these swarming boat attacks where they send, hundreds of small boats out. Maybe they're laden with explosives or they have people with shoulder fired rockets or whatever it is, but they swarm our ships, and there's so many of them, it's very difficult to beat them all. So that limits what our forces can do and where they can go. And if you look at the way the Persian Gulf is laid out, it's very difficult to get in there and operate. It's just a small area to hide and to maneuver. So this threatens how we operate around the world. And of course, the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, you have those narrow sea lanes. And when you go back and look at China, they present a far greater A280 threat because their reach and their number of missiles are far greater, and they're just far better. So China in particular, I'll talk about them for a little bit. Now they've turned these little artificial islands. They weren't even islands before. They've made artificial islands in the South China Sea. These were just rocks that were sticking out of the water, maybe a shallow area in the water in the South China Sea. And often a lot of this stuff was claimed by their regional partner, their regional neighbors. But China went out and said, this is ours. And so they've created little unsinkable aircraft carriers out there out of concrete. And they now have advanced radars out there. They have surface-to-air missiles. They have anti-ship cruise missiles. They have airfields. So they've created a military base there in the South China Sea that's pretty advanced. And when you consider that's a major strategic pathway and a trade route for the United States, it creates a big problem for us strategically. And we also have lots of forward bases in the Pacific, places like Japan, Guam, and whatnot, South Korea. And they are threatened under the umbrella of thousands of land-based missiles out of China. And we did not make the investment to counter this for several years. China's been building this for decades. And we've only recently kind of woken up to this fact and started to build infrastructure to counter this. But we're way behind, and we're way behind many other countries in this. And these missiles, the Chinese missiles are more expensive than what Iran has, but their cost benefit is much greater than ours is, unfortunately. And the economic stakes of losing the South China Sea are pretty dramatic. And because 1/3 of global sea trade goes through that area, and that's over $5 trillion in trade, commercial goods that transit to and from the South China Sea every year. And remember, this isn't just everybody else's trade. This is China's trade. And China sends a lot of critical materials and produced items all over the world, including the United States. Included in that $5 trillion figure is over $1.2 trillion annually for the United States. That's our trade, coming from places like Europe. So that means 14% of all of our oceanborne trade has to pass through the South China Sea every year. And losing that control over that area would produce vastly increased prices because we would have to ship so much farther. Even if we stay in the Pacific, you have to go way south to get around the South China Sea. It's just not an easy place to maneuver geographically. So conflict with China would paralyze global supply chains, and it would choke off a lot of critical trade, both to us and to the rest of the world. And at the end of the day, we would have to engage in a pretty high-end missile war to take that back. And it would be pretty darn costly for us. We're just not set up for it right now. And while Iran is not as bad, it's the same kind of problem. And if we can't win in Iran, we definitely can't win in a China situation. That's a big issue that we need to address. We're going to talk about that here, why this is such a hard problem to solve. And we have several trade routes that are at threat right now in the Persian Gulf, in that area of the world. Like the Straits of Hormuz. Everybody's talking about the Straits of Hormuz. That's the entrance to the Persian Gulf. You got the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Straits over on the other side. That is the waterway that runs between Africa and the Middle East. That's where you get Yemen producing such a big threat to our sea routes and everybody's sea routes over there. So when these ships are in their narrow waters, they lose one of their best defensive abilities, and that's just the ability to hide in open space in the open ocean, as long with maneuver. And you think about that old World War II tactic of how we defended against submarines and how other countries defended against submarines. They basically maneuvered in an S pattern, and that would make the targeting solution for a submarine with a torpedo very difficult because the ship's always moving left and right. It's very hard to lock on where they will be instead of going in a straight line. But you can't do that in these small areas where you have limited maneuverability, as an example. So Straits of Hormuz in particular is only 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point. That's not a lot of space for a ship to maneuver. And even if you look in our own hemisphere, we have the Panama Canal, and that's very small. When you go through there, you get into these locks, these very tiny locks that you have to go through different locks to, as the water is pumped into one and pumped out of another, and you just keep going through until you get to the other side. But there's jungle lining both sides, and if somebody wanted to take out a ship there, whether it's a combat ship or a merchant ship or whatever, they could not only sink the ship, they could block the waterway. And that's 6% of global trade right there they'd cut off very easily, along with our major transit route that goes between our Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And when you think about most of our West Coast oil, refined oil, comes from refineries there in the Gulf Coast. That's a lot of oil that comes through, along with all the other stuff. There's a lot of stuff that comes through there through the Panama Canal to um, supply the West Coast. So it's a problem, along with a place like Hawaii. It's a huge problem. So, ships, as I said, ships can sometimes hide from those land-based radar networks and coastal observation posts. So they can keep from being observed by land. But these satellites, these increasingly sophisticated satellites, make that increasingly difficult. And we have commercial satellites on our side, along with military government-owned satellites, like the Elon Musk's satellites. They've greatly helped Ukraine in its war against Russia, and so we have that technology to back us up as well. But our rivals are working on that too. So that technological superiority we've had is decreasing. And with Iran, they've already built dense coastal defenses with anti-ship ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and drone swarms. And that's what we're fighting every day. That's what our partners in the region are fighting every day. It's trying to counter these. So when we have one of these billion-dollar Navy ships or multi-billion-dollar Navy ships that enter into the Straits of Hormuz, they get trapped inside, and they're in the range of a lot of different types of weapons. And these launchers, you think you can just take them out, and we've been told they've been taken out, but the problem is they are pretty easy to hide because they'll pop out of these tunnels, these well-constructed tunnels. Tunnels have been worked on for decades and reinforced, and they'll come out and they'll launch their missile and they'll go back in. And it's very hard to find them quickly enough and take them out quickly enough to eliminate them. And then there's also decoys out there. So the Iranians will put something out that looks like a missile launcher, and it's not. And we will take out something that will waste ordnance on something that's not really a target. And, I've heard talk of putting ground forces in different areas in Iran, and that's a nice dream, but it would be almost impossible. I guess you could parachute people in, but to try to do that by sea, maybe some special ops guys could get through there. I don't know. But the problem is, even when you're trying to, when you're trying to take ground forces in, you got to take them in by ship for the most part. And like these Marine amphibious assault ships, they carry thousands of Marines, they carry their equipment, lots of heavy equipment, and they are very difficult to defend. They have to take other ships with them to defend them, basically. And Army combat power is the same thing. It moves by sea. And if you sink one of their ships, it's millions of tons of equipment and supplies that'll go to the bottom of the ocean. They can't defend themselves. So even when you're able to bring missile defenses into an area and defend the ships, if those ships are massed, whether it's the cargo ships or our military forces or whatever, if they're in one small area, our enemy can launch salvos and threaten every vessel in the area. It's kind of like what they would do with those small boats. They just send so much that it overwhelms our defenses. And when it comes to protecting oil tankers, and which we're trying to do to get in and out of the Straits of Hormuz, that's the challenge. It's very difficult when you get to these choke points, along with any commercial cargo ships that might go in and out of there. And the big problem is these big ships that carry the oil, they're slow, they're huge, and they're unarmed. So they don't have any way to defend themselves. And then you have, you look at what our military forces have done in missions like Operation Prosperity Guard. That's where we've been escorting commercial ships through the Red Sea, where you have this asymmetric threat, basically people standing on the shoreline and launching shoulder-fired, very cheap rockets. Um, we have our ships out there trying to defend this stuff, but it just shows you can take a shoulder-fired rocket that only costs a few $100s and take out a multi-million-dollar or multi-billion-dollar ship carrying oil or one of our combatants. You can cause massive amounts of damage with just one guy and his rocket. So our ships, our destroyers, and our cruisers, I believe cruisers may have been used in there. At least our destroyers, our military ships, our Navy ships, had to go and sail close to these merchant vessels to shield them from those incoming strikes. And it makes our warships easy targets. And they have the same challenge as the commercial ships in terms of their maneuver. So the enemy doesn't even need to sink these warships to disrupt global trade. They just have to threaten it. They just have to get these shipping companies scared enough that they don't go through these areas. They go, for example, instead of using the Suez Canal, they could sail all the way around Africa, and it just massively raises cost of commerce. And we all know what it's like to pay all this money for gas right now, and that's part of it. So it just adds thousands of extra miles and weeks of extra transit time, and just adds to our fuel costs and the cost of our consumer goods. So escorting these commercial fleets also drains our Navy resources. We only have so many, and we have to run them constantly when we're doing this. We're doing these operations. So that just affects our readiness down the line too, because we can't get them in to do maintenance. They break like anything. When you run it for a long time, they break. And the crew members break also. You can only spend so much time deployed. People are away from their families, and it causes a lot of stress. Besides our ships, our land bases are also under threat. Within the Middle East, there's lots of airfields and supply depots and command centers inside of the Iranian missile range, including the American Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. That's our headquarters of the entire Navy in that region. So we have large facilities that house billions of dollars of our aircraft. These F-35s are very expensive. Our tankers, our refueling aircraft are also expensive. And of course, there's the thousands of service members that are in danger. And Americans don't like losing service members. They're inside these missile envelopes. So when there is a conflict like Iran, even if these bases are defended, it's the same thing. You can just flood that area with hundreds of missiles and get through. And not only missiles, but I don't want to forget about the drones, because they're a big problem too. They're the same thing. They're cheap, and you just flood the zone, and you're going to get some missiles and drones through. It doesn't take that many, especially when you know where to target. So Iran has proven the ability to do this numerous times. Even in Israel, with their Iron Dome, the Iranians have gotten through several times and done a lot of damage. So, when Iran does destroy runways or fuel storage tanks or radar or whatever it is, basically they stop every aircraft that's on that field. Even if they're not damaged, they can't take off. It's the same thing as shooting them down. They're worthless. And when it comes to things like our air refuelers, if they can't get off the ground, then other combat planes that are in the area, they also can't fly. They have to go land somewhere and refuel. So it's a big problem when these land bases we need are in that umbrella. So when you think about a single drone being able to take out a flight line and destroy $1 million, $100 million aircraft, it's a big problem. Um, and when you talk about things that launch aircraft, the aircraft carriers, and going back to the Navy, that is the biggest threat because they're a national asset. They're so expensive. They're such a big part of what our military does with our power production capability. So a successful missile or drone strike can ruin one of those carriers and put out it maybe destroy it. They carry thousands of gallons of aviation fuel, very flammable aviation fuel, along with all of our aircraft carriers are nuclear. So you have the potential of creating a nuclear catastrophe. And it's not just the ship, it's the air wing. You have dozens of aircraft on these aircraft carriers, all the things you need to support those aircraft, all the people. So there's 5,000 plus on a deployed aircraft carrier, 5,000 plus service members on a deployed aircraft carrier. So it's a big deal if you lose one of these. And anybody with these long range missiles can attack an aircraft carrier, and by itself, it doesn't have the ability to defend itself. It needs to travel with Aegis combat system equipped destroyers and cruisers. So it when you're out there operationally with destroyers and cruisers, they're very advanced. As I said before, they're about a billion plus to build one of these, and they carry their ordnance in what they call the VLS system, vertical launch system. It's missile tubes, and you have to share your ordnance between these tubes. It's either you have to choose your land attack missiles, your Tomahawks primarily, or your air defense, your standard missiles. And there's different types of standard missiles. The most sophisticated is the SM-6. It's our best one at destroying ballistic missiles. And once a Navy ship fires all of its defense missiles, that's it. It has to leave. It can't defend itself against the missile swarms. It can still defend against submarines if we have that, but it has to go back and reload. And reload is not easy. They can't just reload at sea. There's not a supply ship that can just bring them missiles at sea, especially when you're in open ocean or in those contested environments in the missile envelope. Missile canisters are just too heavy and too dangerous to lift. It takes special cranes, very heavy lift cranes. They can only reload in areas if they do reload at sea. It has been proven that can happen, but it has to have completely calm waters. So you're talking about someplace in a protected harbor, and even when you can pull into a port, you need special personnel and specialized cranes to reload. There are new technology in development to overcome this problem, but they still haven't been tested fully and deployed. Now, our aircraft carriers are limited because we have gone to this high-tech fourth, fifth generation. During the Cold War, we had F-14 Tomcats, and they had long-range missiles that could fly about 800 miles, but we stopped doing that when we replaced the F-14s with the Super Hornets. We gained a better fighter that could do more things, and it was cheaper to maintain, but we lost a lot of that range. So the Super Hornet, its combat radius is only 400 or 500 miles. Now you can tank it, you can air refuel it, but there's also some trade-offs with that. Now the F-35s, the new F-35s, they can reach a little bit longer, but still they're outranged by the missiles of our most of our rivals. Because our jets have a shorter range than our enemy missiles, carriers have to make a choice. They have to either sail into the missile envelope to launch their planes, or they have to get refueled on the way. Now, we used to have a plane called the S-3, and it was retired about the same time as the F-14 Tomcats, and it was designated as the aerial refueling aircraft for the aircraft carriers, but we got rid of it. And instead, since we didn't have an air refueler, we took our Super Hornets, our combat aircraft, and we made them flying gas stations. We, instead of loading them with ordnance, we load them with big gas tanks, and we do what we call buddy refueling. So one of those Super Hornets refuels the rest of the squadron, and so you have a trade-off, and it's great. And that does extend the range of our carrier aircraft, but it also forces the Navy to trade this offensive weapon for extra gas. So you can develop where you can only deploy as many missiles as you have fighters, and every time you have to send a Super Hornet out there with tanks on it, that's fewer missiles to fight with. Now, the Navy is also developing a drone, essentially, that can do this aerial refueling mission, but we don't have that yet. And it's great that our strategists are thinking of this stuff and creating it, but we don't have it yet. So it doesn't help us with Iran. The big problem here, though, with missile defense is the economic trade-off. And when you look at things like we have our SM2s and our SM6 interceptors, our SM3s on the destroyers, but they're very expensive. The SM2s are about $2 million each. The SM6s are about $4 million, and the SM3s are about $3 million each. Then you got your land-based missile interceptors, the Patriot missiles. And the Patriot missiles really proved their capability during Desert Storm when Saddam Hussein was launching Scud missiles into Israel and different countries in the region. The Patriots were great against those, but not so good against some of these higher technology missiles we're facing now, these ballistic missiles. And those Patriot missiles, they're about $4 million each. Our most high-tech missile interceptors are the THAAD, Theater Air Defense. And each missile costs between $12 and $15 million. And they're fabulous at taking out ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, but it's a big cost, and they're limited. So when you think about that, you're firing these multi-million-dollar missiles to take out a $20,000 missile, or a drone that's only a few $100s, a few $1,000s. It's just unsustainable. Just from an economic warfare perspective, it's unsustainable. That's probably our biggest issue with taking these out. Our ordnance is so much more expensive than what's being fired at us. And that allows our enemies to build so much more ordnance. They pay so much less. Additionally, our interceptors, our missiles that take out other missiles and drones, they require some pretty complex radar guidance systems on the ground, along with some pretty advanced technology within the missile itself. So it takes a lot of expertise to operate these things and build them. Whereas our enemies, they develop these cheap attack drones and missiles with off-the-shelf technology. They don't need any advanced factories. They have simple engines, and they can mass produce them by the thousands. So you look at our sensor networks that could cost over $1 billion with THAAD, and if you take out the sensor networks, which isn't that hard, and it's something that the Iranians have targeted, it makes the cost of the economic cost even worse. So, this economic warfare thing is something that people don't really take into consideration when they build these weapons. And it's a big problem in asymmetric warfare. And all these shortfalls, they just link back to short-sighted decisions. A lot of them were made when we're fighting the war on terror. A lot of them were made when people didn't really want to take the China problem seriously. And there's the greed of the military-industrial complex. And look, I get it. these people want to make money. I don't fault them for that. But when you have these rich military industrial complex oligarchs, these defense industry oligarchs colluding and lobbying with our politicians, offering things like, yeah, I'll put so many jobs in your district if you vote for my weapons acquisition. It's bad. And Eisenhower tried to warn us about that. And so what's happened over time with our massive debt that we've acquired, it's forced austerity and it's eroded our ability to provide adequate defense and keep up with our rivals, even these countries that shouldn't be real rivals, like Iran. And think about this. Iran fought Iraq and, they couldn't defeat Iraq. That's the level of military that they had. We walked right over Iraq a couple of years after that. That was our military superiority at that time. And look what's happened now. We've eroded it so much compared to our rivals. We've allowed them to catch up. In 2010, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Michael Mullen, stated that our national debt was the biggest threat to U.S. national security. He warned that a nation's military power, or national power, lies directly on our economic foundations. As the national debt grows, the interest payments eat up massive portions of the federal budget. And as it stands now, the interest alone on our debt exceeds our military budget. Now, wouldn't it be nice to be able to expand our military if we had to pay less interest on our national debt? That's a big problem, and it's going to squeeze out everything, not just the national debt. Paid effect of all this spending we've done. So that growing debt burden is just going to continue to squeeze the discretionary spending that the military relies on. It's that pool of money that we need to buy these missiles and these systems that we're not going to have, including our research. Our current ordnance shortages can be directly tied to this massive debt and the steps we needed to take to stop really to control that debt, even though we didn't. We ended up not meaning a damn thing. The Budget Control Act of 2011 triggered automatic spending cuts that were called sequestration. And the military had to cut spending because of sequestration. They had capped, unpredictable budgets, so they had to make trade-offs. And they were funding counterinsurgency fights in Afghanistan, some still in Iraq, places like Syria, wherever. These small wars. Afghanistan was kind of a small war at that point, but we were spending so much money to deploy our military there and maintain control. So we cut long-term procurement for a lot of these high-end munitions that we need now. And we did it on the assumption that we wouldn't face a near-peer competitor anytime soon. That gave China a big opening, gave Iran a big opening, it gave Russia a big opening. Look what they did. Countries don't fear us like they did before because they know. When the government stopped ordering missiles, the defense contractors reacted as any business would. They closed down production lines. They consolidated. They laid off a lot of these workers that had been trained to build these missiles and these technologies. They allowed part suppliers to go out of business. And a lot of these key missile production lines, they suffered as a result of budget cuts and our inability to have stable orders. For example, the Tomahawk missile production lines went dormant for several years due to low procurement orders. And the government had to pay a lot of money to restart those when we needed them. And it was the same thing with several other missiles and ordnance, where the military tried to restart some of these lines, and the engineers had to completely redesign some of the components because the original suppliers had gone out of business. Um, and you look at things like the Army; they stopped spending. They deliberately wound down procurement of some of these weapons, so they could make room for newer weapons. They could prioritize newer weapons, but that created bottlenecks for their existing weapons. And when global demand suddenly spiked because of some of these fights we have ongoing, where we needed those older weapons, that created huge shortages. So it's kind of the same way across the board. We've had to rely on foreign military sales to go out to other countries and buy our stuff back or buy stuff they bought from us just to keep ourselves operating. So we are going to continue to have this problem until we can catch up with our actual industrial base. I don't know how long it's going to take, but that's why we can't keep up with what's going on in Iran, and you're going to continue to hear that we have shortages. So I don't know what the short-term answer is going to be if we're going to continue to fight this fight. When you consider the Iranians, when they fought Iraq, they lost 500,000 people, and the Iraqis used chemical weapons on them. That was the amount of will the Iranians had to not surrender. And that wasn't a civilizational struggle. That was a border dispute with their neighbor. How do you make them surrender without massive amounts of production from our industrial base? It's a big problem. So at this point, we have to really repair our infrastructure. We have to do something to bring back our industrial infrastructure. But we're going to be right up against that debt. We're going to continue to have this problem. You look at other issues like, and we haven't had this happen yet, thank God, but we have one of our ships that's hit. It's damaged in combat. We have a shortage of maintenance facilities. We don't have dry docks. We don't have the people capable of repairing that. We have to tow these ships most likely all the way back to the United States, especially things like aircraft carriers. And they're going to be out of the fight for years. And we saw this with, we had a couple ships, the McCain, and there was another one that had collisions at sea in the Pacific a couple of years back. And they had to be towed all the way back to the United States. There's nowhere to take them and dry dock them in Japan or any of our bases in the Pacific. They had to go all the way back home. And they were out of commission for a long time. So if that happens now, that's another one of these things that nobody's thought about. It's a big problem. So when you look at all these struggles we're having, it's clear that our policies must change immediately. We need to think differently, become more efficient, stop relying only on these multi-million-dollar missiles. We need something else to stop these cheap drones and missiles that are attacking us. And we've got some smart people out there that can figure this out, I'm sure. But we have to change the way we think. And a lot of this is in the military industrial complex. We're going to have to do something to get that under control, and stop giving out these huge contracts and think of the U.S. taxpayer and our limited resources. It's, as I've said many times, it's just going to get worse. If we don't adapt, we're just going to put our country at risk. We're going to put our security at risk, our service members at risk. A bigger lesson, though, I think, is we need to learn to stop destroying our combat power in numerous conflicts that really are not a national priority around the world, including Iran, by the way. this was not, you can keep saying that, well, Iran was developing a nuclear missile. Okay, maybe, but a couple things there. If they're developing a nuclear missile, they have no way to deliver that to us. That may be a European problem, it may be a regional problem, but it's not a United States of America problem. The other thing is, I guess everybody's forgetting that Russia and China and even North Korea have nuclear missiles. Russia and China have massive stockpiles of nuclear missiles. We're not taking them out because we understand mutually assured destruction. I am sure Iran understands mutually assured destruction. I really do not think they are suicidal. Why would they be? And if they were suicidal, why not just utilize chemical and biological weapons? Because those are cheaper. It doesn't make sense. So that argument to me is kind of ridiculous for going to war. 100%, if you want to use other levers of national power and continue to negotiate, that's fine. But this military conflict has just created this big problem that I don't think we're going to get out of anytime soon. So, as when you look at other forms of power like soft power and economic power, we have other options. Like Clausewitz said, the old Prussian general and um, one of the most famous military theorists in the world, Karl von Clausewitz, said, "War is continuation of policy by other means." And that was very observant by him because it's politics. We're talking about politics. We can solve it. War is one of the means. We have other options. Um, we need to use those and stop fighting all over the world. Now, the path forward does require addressing our military capabilities. There's no doubt about that. We're going to have to spend some money, but we have to do that while preserving our fiscal foundation, finding ways to solve international relations that does that. We need to keep our military force at home for a while. We need to fix it, and we need to preserve it. We can't go around and expend all this military power um, continuously. And what I'm pretty sure we're doing is we're probably taking stocks of weaponry and fuel and whatever from other places right now that we need it. We're probably robbing Peter to pay Paul. That's the only way I could see it. And that's not good. It's not good. It's like when we drained our strategic oil reserve and we still can't get it refilled. We need that for a real emergency. So, we cannot maintain global leadership if our national debt continues to crowd out necessary investments in other things, including defense. Our national debt is 100% our biggest security threat, and not only externally, but internally. We need to get it under control, and we can only do that with responsible decision makers, responsible politicians, responsible citizens. That's us too. Facing this truth is the only way we can deter American conflict and American weakness in the future. We have to defend our interests, but we need to do it smartly. We need to do it economically. We're not going to be able to in the future. With that, I really appreciate you watching. Take care of yourselves, and thank you for getting me to the Dirty Dozen. I will come out with more content here in the next few days. Please share this with your friends, and I once again really appreciate your support. Have a good night.